This panel session should be as interactive as possible, so please do pop questions into the chat. I think, interestingly from my perspective, I think we've heard a lot of great stuff about principles, processes, protections. I think for starting the panel, we just want to turn that around and look at it from the other side. And there's no place to jump in apart from the deep end, which is what do we think the current challenges are around patient trust in the healthcare sector? And quite frankly, I mean, I live in London. It's quite hard to get on the tube these days without somebody talking about COVID and referring to it as a hoax. There's an obvious distrust of what people are being told. I think there are people fighting against the desire to share data. But so if we can start there with the patient trust and the patient journey, and Marcus, I might turn over to you initially for your thoughts, but what do you see as the current challenges around making sure we can get patient trust for these great things that are being proposed?
Thanks, Andrew. So I think that actually looking at some of the debate around the GP data for planning and research over the last couple of weeks as it played out in the media shows a really interesting example of some of the challenges that you were talking about around patient trust. And one of the things that is quite difficult when we're talking about using data is helping people to understand not just what is being collected and why it's being collected and who's collecting it. We were talking a bit in my breakout room about terms and conditions and whether anyone actually reads them properly. But in a health context, there's this sort of lack of understanding, I think, about what data is collected, how it is then used, and also then who is using it and the purposes for which it is used. So I've seen some research looking at attitudes to health data use, which essentially shows that if you can show people benefits from using health data, and actually maybe COVID and all of the public debate around how data is used to do things like manage lockdowns or determine whether or not we should be 2 meters apart or 10 meters apart or whatever, looking at the benefits that can bring, I think can potentially help people to weigh that up a bit more realistically. And one of the things that I think has been really challenging with the GP data planning and research is just understanding and having that conversation with patients and the public about, you know, there is a misconception that data is being sold to big tech or that it's being accessed sort of willy-nilly without a robust set of controls in place, or that it's being used for purposes which are somehow hidden or not in the public benefit. And I think being able to articulate and explain those quite clearly would help to build patient trust. I'm not saying by any means it's the only thing that we need to do, but I think much more clarity about that would help.
It's a really interesting comment, Marcus. I mean, we looked at this question alongside the Open Data Institute and the Office for AI a while back in terms of what mechanism can be put in place to make people trust in what's going on. And you only have to look back at the NHS care.data previously, where one of the stated goals there was commercialization, and that had a knee-jerk reaction against it. And to cut a long story short, where we got to with the ODI was looking at ways really to instill trust in the whole process. And it involved strong governance that would underpin a clear purpose, and that needed to be clearly articulated. There needed to be transparency of decision-making, and then ultimately some form of accountability too, because you can have the best rules in the world, but if they're not enforced and they're not seen to be being enforced, then that has a negative impact upon engagement. Nick, do you want to add any thoughts to what we're talking about patient trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I look at it is very much also got to be patient-led, in the sense that what you're actually going to do with that data has got to be very clearly articulated with the patient at the heart of the benefit. And if you don't link those two things up within a research context, then there is a disconnect that's very difficult to bridge. I also think that patients need to know and have the right to know what the data is going to be used for, and that's paramount in this debate. I don't think there's enough understanding about what the research benefits are in terms of using data and the different purposes. And I think that's up to the industry and the government and other key stakeholders to be able to articulate that. And for example, how can you actually use this data to improve drug discovery and development, new therapies? How can you improve diagnosis? All of that, there's a sort of, it's hard, it needs to be sort of spoken more about more clearly, I think. And once you do that, then talking around the ethical framework, the governance, the implementation of it all is pretty critical. So what I see, there's a disconnect still at the two, and a lot more needs to be done in terms of articulating that type of discussion more broadly.
So it's a fantastic point. And in that articulation or that clarification as to what is envisaged, do you think it would be helpful to involve the relevant stakeholders? And here I'm thinking about, you know, patient councils inputting into the actual design of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to engage with the relevant stakeholders, and you've also got to provide the context. So you talked about the care.data situation as well. There was no context that was really provided with that. Something was just put into a vacuum, and understandably then there was a reaction to that because there was not an understanding of what was being done, so it wasn't well done. So I think it's very much important to frame the debate and the argument about what are the benefits, what are the risks, and what are the problems that have got to be overcome, and also being transparent about the issues. So, you know, some of the things have been discussed already. We really need to be sort of clear and open about defining those risks and how those risks are mitigated.
Yeah, it's a good point. And on care.data, there was an overarching purpose stated, but there was no detail there, no actual governance to reassure people, I think, that other things had been looked at to underpin what was being proposed. Margi,
could I add one point, Andrew? Sorry,
yeah, sure.
Just before you move on to the next one on that point. So the organizations we looked at for the case study both had mechanisms to involve patients and the public in decisions, both to inform their own research priorities. So the Centre for Epidemiology had a sort of not a focus group, but a group of patients and people living with the disorders that they studied, who helped them to inform what they should actually study. And then also in terms of making decisions about individual requests for data, there were mechanisms there for patient and public engagement. So I think, and then doing things, sort of simpler things like, you know, publishing requests on their website, so anyone could go online and see, you know, who has requested access to data for what purpose, and whether that request has been approved or denied, or approved with some conditions.
So, Marcus, just one short note. Thanks. When we are speaking about raising the awareness between the patients in terms of, you know, getting them more informed about all these AI implications in the healthcare sector, and using the personal data, I think we should also work on the simplified language, you know, because there is one situation when a patient is reading a 10-pager, a disclaimer. You know, few of us are lawyers, we understand what this means, but basically we are talking with the general population. So I think when we do talk about raising the awareness between the patients, we should also simplify the language towards the patients.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. The other point about involving people, as we were talking about with Nick earlier, in the design of the process, is that it's such a simple thing that I think people forget. If you involve somebody in the actual design process, they feel ownership of what's being proposed and are therefore that much more likely to trust in it, I think. Margi, did you want to add anything on patient trust?
I'll add a couple things. One, there are some efforts in pharmaceutical industry and clinical trial industry, actually by CROs and such, to make patient consent forms a lot more accessible and readable, even having mobile apps and that sort of thing, where you can navigate to the section you're trying to look for. Because if you just give them, like you said, Marcus, a 20-page packet of paper, it's gonna get filed away somewhere. They're not going to understand it. So there are efforts to make these a bit more, you know, patient-centric in design, really, for the consent form, so people can access it and understand it. And another thing I think that would go a long way for patient trust is to demonstrate that they're still the owners of their data, and they can withdraw their consent and exercise things like their right to be forgotten if they ever feel the need to. And we, as the data custodians or data users, need to respect that and truly remove them from the data set whenever they ask, and I think just that that sense of respect to the patient, that, listen, we understand this is yours, you donated it. If you don't want us to use it, we will respect that. And making them know that they do have these rights can go a long way in building trust too, saying we're not here to take advantage of you.
Yeah, it's a great point. And interestingly, looking at the chat, Stuart from AstraZeneca talking about the tension between gathering data, requiring people to opt out rather than to opt in, and how that might be done, and whether there could be some collective solution there that allows people to, well, essentially a structure in which people trust to deal with their data in a way that they feel to be appropriate, which then is a kind of halfway house, I guess, between being able to scale and being an individual and making decisions on that basis. So we're absolutely not trying to avoid the hard questions today. So the next one we have is, in the healthcare sector, to what extent do we feel there exists inherent gender, ethnic, or geographic bias in AI-based systems? And what do we think needs to be done to prevent this? So Margi, if I may, I'll stay with you to kick off on this one.
Yeah, so historically in clinical research and those sort of data sets, the type of patients that you have are male-centric. There's a lot more men than women. It's a lot more Caucasians than other ethnicities. And it's concentrated in urban areas, typically, where people have access to these types of, research hospitals, clinical trial centers, that sort of thing. So there is if you use historic data or cleaned data sets that you might be purchasing or sharing, there's always the risk of that. A way that companies and data service providers can solve for that is, one, be clear about the type of data you do have, like maybe a nutrition label type of thing for this data set, saying this is what you're dealing with now. That's more of a buyer beware type of interaction, where you can say, well, this is what you have. You do what you need to do to supplement this, or actually try and collect more diverse data, set quotas for your data sets, even if it means your trial, your collection time can go longer. Another piece that happens is sometimes is the geographic and socioeconomic difference in the research and the technologies that come up. So if you think about new robotically assisted or robotically run surgeries, where does the NHS trial that? They trial that in normally a hospital or district with a lot more resources. That neighborhood or that area gets the benefit of this new technology, whereas others might need to travel farther to use it, or might have to forego, and the pool of money might get moved around. So there are existing biases in data sets, but there's also the way we typically conduct research, because we're trying to reach that patient population. It's concentrated in urban areas. So there's a methods bias and a data bias there that we're trying to overcome as an industry.
That's fascinating. And do you think there's also a trust issue in certain demographics and ethnic areas that means people can try to get the data, but it may not be as readily available as they would like?
Absolutely. I mean, people, and I was looking into health disparities when I lived in the US also, and you may have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And that was a very unethical bit of research that was done back in the early 20th century. And it has led to a societal lack of trust or reduced trust in research and data collected and essentially experimenting on a human by the government, because people's health and lives are taken advantage of. Another one is Henrietta Lacks, whose HeLa cells created the first cancer cell line that's been used extensively in research. But she didn't necessarily fully know what she was consenting to, and her cells from her tumors were taken advantage of. So there are missteps done in the past in the US and beyond too, and that has led to some levels of distrust. Also, lack of knowledge of what happens to your data if it goes into a black box or open to the world. That also does cause some distrust.
Yeah, absolutely understood. Nick, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, thanks. So obviously bias inevitably exists everywhere we look at, but how it's diagnosed is the key. And the other level of bias that can be introduced is the type of question you're asking. So when you're applying AI approaches to different data sets, you can sometimes have what you would call a clinically driven question, or you can have a data-driven question. And those two approaches are very different, and the answers that you come out with will be different. The key with that, though, is actually how you identify the different biases in that data, and then what you do about removing those biases. And certainly when we look at real world data over different demographics, for us, it's very much a lot of the discussion is how do you take out that bias? How do you test against it? And how can you actually be sure that you've got something that is unbiased or has been sort of proofed against that as best as possible? So for us, very much the world is bias is there inevitably, but it's really what you do to remove it, reduce it, and recognize if you can't remove it, that there is an issue there.
Yeah, recognition is a massive point, isn't it? Marcus, I suspect you're going to tell us you've got all the technology to sort this out.
No, I think that this often it's not a problem that can be solved with technology. I think technology can help in a sense. So what I was going to say in response to the sort of bias and mistrust question is, are the questions that you're trying to answer the right questions based on the data that you have and the quality of it and understanding your data? And actually, we can take a different example of the A-level results decision making that happened last year, which was based on historical performance data in schools. And actually, I've heard many people who are much more expert about the way that statistical analysis worked than I am, who essentially say that it answered the question that was set for it by the policymakers. And there were well understood limitations to what that data could be used to achieve before those decisions were taken. It was just that policymakers decided to go down a certain route. So I think there's a real question when you're assessing a request to access data to really interrogate, is the question that's being asked a question that you can actually answer with the data you have, given all of the limitations that others have just talked about in terms of quality, representativeness. There's been some stuff in the chat as well about whether the data matches up with the different sort of demographic and socioeconomic representative factors.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and being absolutely clear on the purpose. I mean, there are basic building blocks here. But what is the data you actually want to collect? With whom is it going to be shared, and for what purpose? And what can they use it for? So once you've got those in place, then I think you can start building out. And if we're talking about going out to stakeholders and seeking to engage trust, those are key building blocks. And I absolutely take the point, and we'll probably come back to it later, the point in the chat about competence is also an issue here. And if systems fall over, that doesn't instill people with confidence in what's being proposed. So moving on to personalized healthcare.
Andrew, could I interrupt? It's just a very, well, I think it's quite an interesting question. It's just come in from, is it just in the chat, Pei Li Chong from GSK for Nick? I just wondered whether you might be able to run that past Nick. It's quite an interesting one.
Sure, Nick. So I don't know if you can see this, but it's a question, can you give examples of data-driven questions versus clinical-driven questions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, for example, if you looked at something like heart failure, and one of the measurements in in heart failure is looking at ejection fraction. And there's a defined sort of parameters around ejection fraction, volume of blood that is moved through the heart. If you have a clinical question, you may frame it in relation to different levels of ejection fraction. So that would be a clinically driven question. For a data-driven question, you wouldn't actually bother with that. You'd look at all the features associated with the heart failure. You'd combine the data, do the analysis, and see what you came out with. So you'd have no inherent clinical questions in that data-driven question. Whereas in the clinical question, you'd be relating it to the diagnosis and the criteria for the diagnosis.
Great, thanks, Nick. So moving on to personalized healthcare. Now, again, we've been talking about the tension between the individual and the broader data sets. So what does personalized healthcare actually mean to us? And do we think AI currently goes far enough to offer truly personalized healthcare. So Nick, I'll stick with you if I may to kick off on this.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think at its simplest, personalized healthcare is really having the right target, the right drug, and the right patient. But actually getting to that point is pretty challenging because patient populations are typically very heterogeneous. And it is that heterogeneity and the features around that are often unknown. To get towards that, you actually need to define more homogeneous populations. And that's something where having real world data, applying AI and ML techniques to sub-phenotype, if you like, those populations to make them more homogeneous is very beneficial. And obviously there are genetic markers and other ways of doing that. Essentially then the personalized medicine is more targeted. But overall, then you have a balance in terms of being able to identify those targets, looking at the efficacy and safety profile of those drugs against the size of the patient population. And when then you move downstream in terms of those medicines being approved, how you price them and reimburse them, then there is a fundamental tension between the size of the population. So if you have a very small patient population, the R&D cost to develop that may impact how you price it against a broader patient population. So as I look at it, it's kind of a continuum in terms of moving from that population health to that personalized healthcare. And I believe that the richness of the data that you can get out of working with real world data, clinical data, and then applying sensible algorithms and asking the right questions can really give you very interesting insights on what the right therapies are, the right types of clusters of populations that are closely defined and better defined that will then improve that development pathway.
And of course, getting to that position of personalized healthcare, we need to have the data in the first place in order to be able to focus in on it. Margi, did you want to add anything to personalized healthcare?
Yeah, well, I believe one of the goals of using artificial intelligence is to study the larger, the more multifarious, diverse populations, but eventually find the right treatment or right preventative measures for the right patient. And it is technically used for personalized healthcare in pharmaceutical trials already. Many companies try to develop algorithms to look at clinical, demographic, medical history data, that sort of thing, and determine which patients are best for which trial, maybe which arm of a trial. If a trial is looking at, say, different dosing schemes of a cancer therapy, of chemotherapy with radiation therapy, or a different cocktail of medications, they may actually try and stratify patients into a smarter arm of the trial for them based on their profile. So it is being, I think, one of the goals. It does sound like it's a mass generalization in many ways when you're taking in so much data, but one of the outcomes is you're more personalizing, even in a trial setting, so that once you go to market, this the AI generated hypotheses, if the drug gets approved, can help create a more personalized solution per patient in the future.
I'm just wondering how we best articulate that, because it comes back to actually making people appreciate the benefits of what is possible. It feels, so for me as a layman, it feels a way out in the distance. Doesn't feel that real at the moment, but are there steps we can do to encourage that?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, one of the realities is this sort of thing happens. It's still quite new and developing in many companies, but it's also it's a very back-end thing. It's not an AI system that's deployed. It's not an app. It's not something the patient or the doctor technically uses yet. As it's seen more probably in clinics, genetic sequencing was deeply mistrusted, and then you suddenly started seeing MySeq machines in different hospitals that do quick genome panels and that sort of thing to see if a patient has a breast cancer mutation, something like that. And slowly people began to trust it. I think as it moves more into view, into a clinic, and a doctor can articulate, or clinician can articulate, listen, we did this, we used this AI system, and because of this, we're leading to, we have 10 options, we're going to choose the best one for you.
Really interesting. So perhaps a little chicken and egg, but being able to demonstrate in some form the benefits will encourage take up. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, Marcus, did you want to add anything to this?
Only to just reflect on the idea that we talk a lot at the moment about sort of de-identifying or anonymizing or pseudonymizing data, and that works when what we're trying to get to is an insight from a large population level or similar scale data set. So if you want to draw general conclusions about a population cohort, then you can use those techniques. And actually what will often happen is that the insights will then inform a clinician. So the clinician then makes the decision about, okay, using the insight from a large study, I know that in general, people react in this way or that way, or people like you, the patient in front of me, react in this way or that way to certain treatments or drugs. And personalization is just taking that one step further, where the patient themselves, and as Margi was saying, it's not yet at the stage where the patient's interacting with the AI, but where the clinician is kind of filtering that information for them. So I think that will be an interesting development, because it will require patients to provide much more data as they, potentially looking at things like streaming data from wearable devices or sequencing genomes and that sort of thing. So the debate about the extent to which someone is identified or not identified, it becomes quite interesting with personalized medicine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one question that's come in from the floor, this is from Nicole. What levels of trust in data used to stratify clinical trials, for example, are you seeing with the regulators?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that the regulators are very interested in being able to identify the basis of that data, how it's validated and qualified, and the quality of it is actually essential to it. And you've also got to really link it into that clinical outcomes in terms of your primary and secondary outcomes of what you're looking at. So there's a great deal of interest in sort of digging into detail about how you do this. I mean, one of the things that I think is an interesting ethical question going out from this is when you're looking at placebo controls, particularly in life-threatening diseases, and whether you can use pre-existing placebos from other trials to inform your decision-making about what the standard of care is. And then also looking at real-world data to support a deeper understanding of the current standard of care. And I think there's quite a lot that could be done there to sort of dig deeper into understanding that current standard of care, which will then give a better comparator to your active arm in clinical trials.
Is there, I mean, there's an enormous amount of data out there, but in our breakout group, we were talking a little bit about interoperability and the fact that are you looking at like for like, and has it been collected in the same way, and is it truly comparable? Are we seeing steps there to isolate those differences so as to be able to combine the data sets, or are we still some way off from that?
I mean, we have a common data model, which we apply across our partnerships with NHS trusts. So we make sure that the diversity of the data in different trusts, and there is a lot of differences across trusts, we actually have that structured in a common model, which is curated and we know is fit for purpose in terms of the questions we ask. And I think one of the previous speakers or questions that came in was, how do you know whether the data is good enough? It really links into what question you're asking and what are the features of that data to answer that question. So you've got to dig into detail around that.
Got it. Okay. I think we may just have time for one more question. So we know that many organizations they're at the beginning of this journey to understand key data governance foundations in healthcare, but many of them are struggling to implement them in practice across their organizations. So what advice would you offer to them at the beginning of that journey? I mean, Nick, I'll stay with you for this one, if I may.
Yeah, thanks. So I think first and foremost, there are a few principles that need to be looked at. And first is that the science and what is actually done has got to be led by the patient outcome and purpose. Also, it's got to be recognized that the healthcare industry is already regulated and takes that extremely seriously. And then the data governance piece is part of that regulation. But all of that has to be clinically led and aligned with the national and international standards and regulations. When we started out on this journey, for us, it was very much about building this from the bottom up. And you've really got to get in amongst what are the requirements regulatory, how that influences the employees, how that influences your partners, how that influences everything you do, and then build out the governance processes from that bottom up. At the same time, though, you do need senior level input and sponsorship of that. So ideally, you would have people at board level that have their focus around how you implement that and do that properly, and what are the steps and procedures you have. And then the other thing is really to go down a pathway of making sure that you're tested and validated against the different regulations, whether that's going across standards, getting accreditations, and then compliance with the relevant regulatory standards.
That's really interesting. And Margi, you spoke earlier very compellingly about the journey that AstraZeneca has been on, and it's obviously a leader in this field. I mean, first of all, would you echo Nick's sentiments? And I guess a follow-up question to that is, on the ground, in terms of everyday people thinking about the principles and applying them, are you seeing this become part of the corporate culture?
First, yes, I absolutely echo Nick's sentiments, especially the patient-centric and clear benefits to the patients that you must need, that you must have when using these tools, and also the senior buy-in of using them the right way, using them responsibly, and understanding what the gap is between your existing data governance, your existing regulations, and what the possibilities of using artificial intelligence to achieve your goals better, faster, and more accurately. And then trying to bridge that gap using governance, using culture, that sort of thing. So, and again, as I mentioned before, in terms of the practical application, existing process, no one wants in the real world another set of forms to fill out if they can help it. But if you can tag on to whatever existing process is possible, obviously do yourself a gap analysis first. And if you can find that, we have some privacy and security questions about the tool, this AI tool, add it to your privacy evaluation, that sort of thing. Set accountabilities within your company as well, so that you know how to escalate a problem. And the training is the easiest way to embed this in the culture. Asking yourself, finding the checkpoints where things can go wrong, and asking questions simply that not just developers and programmers can understand, but maybe a product owner or someone that's setting up a third-party AI vendor can be able to ask and articulate and understand the risks. So make it usable for not just data scientists as well.
Perfect. So, and also, I guess that it's like carrot and stick approach. Appreciate the benefits that go behind this, as well as some of the risks. Marcus, did you want to add to that?
Just to agree with Margi and with Nick, and to say that actually one of the things that we're trying to do, looking at this from kind of a people and processes perspective, is how do you then transform the principles that Nick was talking about, or the ethical sort of guiding principles, into something that is operational, that a business can actually do and potentially do at scale. Because looking at it from data access requests, I mean, if you're sitting on data that has value for research purposes, you want to be able to enable people to access that in a sort of streamlined way. They don't have to wait months or potentially years. They can see what data is available, and they can make some judgments about whether or not that data would be useful for the purposes that they want to achieve. So how do you as an organization actually then transform that into a process that says, we do this first and this person is responsible for that, and then it kind of works as a workflow. So that's one of the questions that we're at Privitar actually trying to solve.
I thought your chart earlier was really insightful, just looking at how you start from the beginning and get to the end. It's seeing it laid out like that was particularly enlightening.
For each of the case studies, there is a chart that charts so you can actually look and see the differences between the processes at CUH and the Center for Epidemiology.
One of the things that we did develop in AstraZeneca is a conglomeration, a SharePoint page really, of different best practices for different areas of the business where you're using artificial intelligence. And this is a living, evolving tool, because obviously regulations are still being developed. New questions come up, new risks come up. But one of the tools we developed is a questionnaire of quality assurance that people can use when they're evaluating their own tool before it's going into production or the clinic. or even evaluating a different tool that they're trying to onboard about data exploration, model development, risks and transparency, trust, diversity of data, that sort of thing. And just having that, that's what people are used to. Having that as a starting point is where helps people think through the risks and the impacts.
Fantastic. I'm just going to say a very quick thank you to Margi, Marcus and Nick for all of your input. Fascinating discussion.